You're listening to New Abolitionist Radio with Max Parthas, Scotty Reid, and Yohanan EliYah. We'll be right back after these messages with our special guest, George Mallinckrodt, licensed psychotherapist and author of the book, Getting Away with Murder. Peace and welcome back to New Abolitionist Radio. Our next guest coming up is George Mallinckrodt. And as we said, he is the author of the book which talks about Darren Rainey. And you've heard of Darren Rainey here on New Abolitionist Radio. He is the man who was literally boiled to death by two guards in a shower. And he was burned so badly that people had to clean up his skin afterwards.
Well,
so,
we're going to
amazing story.
We're going to go ahead and give him a call, see if we can get him on.
Yes, I came in contact just following these stories. Also, Julie K. Brown from the Miami Herald, as well as George Mallinckrodt, are very deep in the midst of this. Good evening, George.
Yes.
This is Yohanan from New Abolitionist Radio, and we have Max Parthas and Scotty Reid on the line with us. Also, we're live and on air, sir. How are you this evening?
I'm doing great, thanks. It's great to be on.
Greetings and welcome to the show,
yes,
George Mallinckrodt.
Yes, welcome.
We have heard some really good stuff coming about your history and the things you've been involved with and what you're doing. I believe Yohanan is going to tell us a little bit about it as well as you are.
Yes. Should I go first, or?
Yeah, feel free to give us your bio, give us some information about who you are and the work you were doing for the Department of Corrections down there in Florida, and really how you came into understanding the abuses and the things that we've covered here on this program for months.
Okay. I worked as a psychotherapist in a psychiatric unit inside a state prison called Dade Correctional Institution. And I worked there for nearly 3 years. And at first I was seeing abuse of inmates by guards, but I didn't really label it as such because I was, sort of green behind the ears, so to speak. And it wasn't until really 2 months before I was fired when an inmate was beaten by guards. He was taken to a hallway, cuffed behind his back, thrown to the concrete floor, and 4 or 5 guards just started beating on him. And unbeknownst to them, my coworker came from another hallway and saw the whole thing, and she was banging on the window, stop, stop, stop. And happened from that is she told her supervisor, who was the site manager for Horizon Health Incorporated, about her eyewitness account. And she said she was so intimidated by the guards that on the incident report, she wrote down that she didn't see a thing, and her supervisor signed off on it, effectively covering up this beating. I couldn't sit still for it, and I ended up reporting it not only in the prison, doing an incident report in prison, but also contacting Tallahassee to speak to a deputy inspector general, and I filed a report there as well. In addition, I spoke to the warden at the time, Jerry Cummings, and he seemed earnest and truly interested in what I was telling him about the abuses that I started to hear about in the unit, including the beating. But nothing really absolutely nothing came of that. The guards that beat the guy were still working there, and they weren't transferred. They weren't reprimanded in any way that I could tell. The warden asked me to do more incident reports as I found out about the abuse from the inmates who would tell me stories that were happening in the unit. And I guess they really didn't like the fact that I was pursuing this rather strongly, and 2 months later I was fired.
Wow.
Yeah, that had to be.
And so
that had to be. Oh,
go ahead.
I was just going to say that had to be an interesting moment to be caught in the system and not getting any traction as far as trying to report on it or get anybody to do anything about it, but then also maybe being set free, so to speak, when they did let you go. I mean, how did that affect what has become of you now as an activist against this system?
Right. It was really frustrating when I was working there. I tried to raise the issue in a morning meeting. There were psychiatrists there, all the other counselors, senior psychologists, and no one wanted to talk about it. When I was fired, I did the best I could just to distance myself from the whole prison experience. I was, pretty shaken by it and upset. About 10 months later, my former coworker who still worked there, I answered the phone typically as we would do, hello, and she blurted out, "They killed him!" And it was Darren Rainey. She described the details of his death, or I really would rather call it a murder, because guards had taken him and put him into a shower where he had no control over the temperature. In other words, the guards could control the temperature. So they locked him in there and turned on only the hot water, which I know from working there was blistering hot. And they left him there to die. And I couldn't sit by for that either. I didn't expect my
under the
coworker
impression that he was actually held
to come forward.
under the shower. Was that correct?
Pardon?
We were under the impression that the guards physically held him under the shower.
No, I think Max mentioned. Yohanan had reported, Max, that it was like a box. And Yohanan, didn't you say it was a contraption, a similar contraption goes back to the 1800s that enslaved Africans were tortured with?
Okay, I understand. So it was a box.
No, not.
That I get.
Yeah. Yeah, the shower stall was, if you think of something about the size of a phone booth. And so with water that hot, which could have been anywhere from 160 to 180 degrees, Darren Rainey became overwhelmed. He may not have initially been directly in the stream of the scalding hot water, but he ended up collapsing from what I understand from the Herald stories, and he was found with 90% of his skin had peeled off. So my coworker gave me that account, and I called up somebody I know. He's a U.S. attorney, and he put me in touch with somebody in the local Department of Justice who organized an interview with FBI agents. So I gave the FBI agents all the details that would emerge 2 years later in the Miami Herald story. They said, well, would your coworker agree to wear a wire? And I thought, what is this, a movie or something? Are you kidding? I said, that's not going to work because we have to pass through a metal detector in every day on our way to work. And another reason it's not going to work is we don't hang out with correctional officers. It's not like we pull up to the lunch table and say, hey, what'd you do to that inmate today? So it was completely unreasonable. And then I said, the fact that security guards scalded this guy to death, isn't that enough to warrant opening an investigation? And they passed.
Quick question, how was it ruled? How did the coroner or the ME rule it?
It is still pending. In other words, the coroner has not decided upon a cause of death, and the police investigation is still pending as well, and this is over 2 years later.
This is like a whole conspiracy. Like literally so many people involved in different branches and areas in order to keep this thing hidden.
Keeping the story going.
Even the medical examiner can't say what it is because he knows if he tells the truth, then there has to be an investigation because this is homicide.
Yeah, and it's almost like a case of hot potato. The medical examiner is saying that the police department has to come up with their conclusions of the investigation. Meanwhile, the police department is saying the medical examiner...
I'm sorry. Give me just a moment. Somebody's mic was messed up. It's stopped now. Please continue. Sorry about that.
Okay. So they're both passing the buck to one another, and nothing is being done. Because of the Miami Herald stories, there's been a lot of heat turned up. And what had happened there, oddly enough, is I tried various things to get people to look at Darren Rainey's murder. I called the medical examiner myself dozens of times. I called the police department. I filed a complaint with the Department of Justice, and I was getting nowhere. And so one of my responses was to write the book that I called Getting Away with Murder, because I thought, you know what? If no one's listening to me, I'm going to write a book, and they're going to hear about it one way or another. And so that was a project I started 2 years ago, and when the Miami Herald story came out, I was into final edits. I immediately contacted Julie Brown, she's the reporter, and in the next article, the second article, my name appeared as, you know, a licensed mental health counselor who's coming forward to corroborate the details of her first story, which, amazingly enough, were gotten by an inmate who was in the unit when Darren Rainey was killed. He heard his screams, he saw what happened, and over 2 years ago, he tried to get the DOC to investigate. He filed grievance after grievance after grievance, and no one listened to him either. So I was a little surprised that while I was trying to work it from the outside, he was working it from the inside.
And they're resisting you all on all sides.
You know, this whole Miami-Dade thing is not just the prisons either. We report a lot about everything from the racist police force in Miami-Dade all the way up to the circumstances involving the prisons there. When you were employed there, were you employed under Jerry Cummings?
Yes, there were two wardens, actually. Jerry Cummings came on board maybe 3 or 4 months prior to the end of my my employment there. So he was you know, he didn't come on years ago. I mean, it had been, you know, a brief time. And then of course, you've probably read in the papers, he was subsequently fired last month or so by the Secretary Cruz of the DOC.
Yeah, he just came out with an article that he did about what he saw there. Just came out.
Right, now he wants to talk.
Yeah, and one of the things he says kind of blows my mind as well. He says, inside, he recalls, he found doors wide open, an understaffed officer's station, guards asleep, and a roster count of inmates that didn't add up. About the only thing that surprised Cummings after 30 years in the state prison system was that Dade inmates weren't escaping more frequently. Just about every area of the prison was broken or corrupted, he said, all the way down to a maintenance worker he alleged was so involved in smuggling drugs and cigarettes to sell to inmates that he never had time to do his job. Is that what you saw as well?
In the unit where I worked, I'll tell you exactly what I saw. A lot of the infrastructure was in disrepair. There had been drywall from a ceiling that had just collapsed because of a roof leak. The air conditioning worked only 10% of the time. The inmates, had no air whatsoever, and their windows were set in stainless steel frames, so they got no airflow whatsoever. It was super hot in there during the summer. At least the inmates out in the compound had, you know, fans and louvered security windows, and, you know, they could get at least a draft. But these guys were, you know, often I would walk by their cells, and they'd be sitting on their bed in their underwear because they were so hot. The one thing that I think Warden Cummings exaggerates a little bit is that when he said he went through the unit, he was overwhelmed by the smell of urine and feces. I can tell you that was not the case usually. We'd have inmates that would maybe collect their feces in styrofoam cups and whatnot, and sometimes you'd get urine under the door. And so the unit would smell a little bit more pungent on those occasions, and then when it was cleaned up, it went to the baseline smell, which is, if you can imagine, a bunch of guys hanging out with, you know, their laundry maybe not done all at once, it kind of smells like a stale, kind of a man sweat kind of situation. So his account of feces and urine was a little exaggerated. But the unit, doors didn't work. In fact, on the other side in the east wing, one of the upstairs cell doors was totally broken, and it happened to be, as I wrote in my book, a meeting place for one of the staffers on our staff and an inmate that she had fallen in love with. And they had a sentinel outside the door. I mean, this is Dade CI at its finest, looking out, to give them some privacy. Then the sentinel turned on the woman and said, "If you don't bring in drugs, I'm going to reveal your situation." Dade CI was, to also confirm parts of the article, it was known as a lazy camp statewide. Inmates coming in would tell me, "Oh yeah, Dade CI, it's a lazy camp." And what that meant was that security was lax, and they could get away with much more at Dade CI than in other facilities. But the problem is, in my facility, the guards were lazy to the point where they wouldn't get the inmates' basic necessities like soap, toilet paper, bath towels, and guys would have to go without toilet paper for 3 or 4 days.
Now, George, when you mentioned about the it being a lazy facility or the lax security, and even Cummings coming back and talking, now he's going to tell all about how bad things are. I mean, that fact is all verified basically by this recent escape. I mean, that's a news story that just popped out a couple of days ago. They had an inmate actually escape from the from Dade, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Dade CI, and apparently hid in a trash bin, and then other inmates emptied the bin, and he went scampering off. And apparently the other inmates, don't want to snitch anybody out, so they didn't tell anybody. And he went off and stole a truck from a tree farmer and headed up north, where he was eventually caught in Palm Beach County. I'm sorry, couldn't hear that?
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, and so this is one of 3 escapes I know about. When my facility was being built back in, I think, 2005, inmates ripped out a carpet in one of the rooms that I would counsel inmates in the future, and they slung it over the razor wire and escaped. They pulled a guy over, took his truck, but they forgot to take his cell phone. And so he called the police, and they were apprehended soon afterward. And I only knew about that because I asked one of my fellow coworkers who had been there a while. I said, "What happened to this carpet here in this interview room?" And so she told me the story, and I was like, "Really? Are they ever going to replace the carpet?" No, they never did.
Well, you mentioned about the name or the inmates not wanting to tell whatever happened with the guy escaping, but that kind of leads me back to a question I wanted to ask you about the inmate that you mentioned was sending up petitions and trying to work the Darren Rainey situation from the inside while you were working on the outside. Do you think can you disclose his name or any more information about him? I mean, what his fate has been in the time since?
Yes, I can say that when I was in the unit, he was there as well, even though that was a year earlier than the Darren Rainey killing. Mm-hmm. And his name was named in the paper. His name is Harold Hempstead. I mean, I am amazed by his courage, because in the DOC, they get rid of you. They could have killed him.
Yes.
Well, yeah. And they've got a Florida Department of Corrections inmate mortality website. So, they can get rid of you. So, we can see that,
So I was amazed. I believe now that he has been in the public, his name has been in the public, it's been mentioned numerous times. I believe it makes him safer because, if anything suspicious were to happen to him, I think, that would really bode poorly for the DOC.
It's still a risk, and they could do it and get away with it and quiet it down without much difficulty, but it would cause questions to start being answered on an already chaotic situation that they're trying to cover up right now, and I don't think they want to risk it getting any worse than they can manage at this point. So he's probably is safe. I kind of feel the same way with us with the radio station, because the things we talk about here, by default are part of the risks that people like him are taking. We're helping to get those messages out. Same risk that you're taking. And I pray that your safety is also there for you when you need it.
I think about that all the time now. And when I thought that I was working this angle alone, no newspaper articles to back me up, nothing like that, I really worried about my safety, because these correctional officers all have guns, and they've already killed people. What's one more?
That's right. That's right. There is a safety factor involved. I can attest to that firsthand. We're going to go to a quick break. Yeah. But before we go to the break, I want to ask a quick question regarding the book. Congratulations on the book. Is the family of Darren Rainey any way involved in this book? And will any proceeds be going towards them, or maybe a foundation for him or anything like that?
Well, at this point, the book is just barely out and barely selling. And to tell you the truth, I've thought about it, and I think that if the book, starts selling millions of copies, of course, I'd like to, give to organizations that promote prison reform. I am in contact with Darren Rainey's brother, I believe his last surviving relative, and he is pursuing a wrongful death lawsuit against the DOC. How that's progressed so far, I couldn't tell you.
Well, I hope that your book is successful and sells millions of copies, so everyone will know, and that both you and his surviving brother will be enriched because of the story that you told. You're listening to New Abolitionist Radio with Max Parthas, Scotty Reid, and Yohanan EliYah. After the break, if you'd like to call in, the number is 1-530-881-1400. Access code 549032#. We'll be right back after these messages. Peace and welcome back to New Abolitionist Radio. We're here talking with George Mallinckrodt today and getting the story about Darren Rainey and his experiences, and also with his new book, Getting Away with Murder, A True Story.
Where can I get the book?
Exactly, that's what I was about to say. Where can the book be found?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
If someone would like to purchase the book, where could they go?
Oh, it's on CreateSpace, Amazon. It's everywhere now. You can, as soon as it goes on Amazon, it seems like it goes everywhere in the world.
Pretty much, yes. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Just type in Getting Away with Murder, A True Story by George C. Mallinckrodt. That's Mallinckrott.
I have a question. Can I be heard?
Go ahead.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I have a question. Later on, if we have opportunity, after we speak with you, sir, we will be talking about the midterm elections. And we have been paying attention to the governor's race in Florida, being that, the connections of Rick Scott to the GO group, which held its CEO, George Zoley, held a fundraiser for him, $10,000 a plate. But then also, we were also looking at it from the angle of his opponent, Charlie Crist. And you live in Florida. I'm assuming you still live in Florida. But at any time, had you heard of Charlie Crist going after Rick Scott for the more than 80 open investigations into the deaths of prisoners in the Florida Department of Corrections? I have not seen any, and how could anyone leave that out, in a political battle like that?
Yes, sadly, we heard nothing from Charlie Crist, and I reached out to some politicians that he knew, and they knew him, and I tried to get this on the agenda. Because this demonstrates Rick Scott's lack of leadership. Rick Scott basically has said nothing about
at
this.
Worst.
And the DOC is the largest agency in Florida.
Right. It's not a small matter. That, like you said, that's the largest agency. How does that stay off of his radar is beyond me. I mean, it's
unless he has stake in it, unless he's
absolutely
part of the team.
Absolutely is. And Rick Scott has been behind the effort to privatize our prisons here in Florida. He was thwarted by a collection of people, including the Corrections Officers Union. So it's no surprise that he's remained silent.
I remember him saying that he would privatize for no less than a 7% savings on costs. So he had already set his limit, and I bet you he probably
told them what number to bring in. Yeah, he told them what number to bring on the bid for the work. He told them what number to already bring in. I'll take 7%, and they took it. They knew that it's an ever increasing. I mean, we've demonstrated through this program several times how these contracts with the private prisons are continually evolving, and the prices continue to go up. The rates continue to increase, and they continue to put pressure on the states to, pay more and more money per inmate and extend the terms of the agreements also. George, I also wanted to ask you if you could speak about the healthcare system that's in place in the prisons. I mean, were you there working for Corizon or Prison Health Industries or any one of these main ones that we know of?
Yes. My last employer was Corizon Health Incorporated. They had won the contract from another concern called MHM Services. And I can tell you that the medical care was subpar. I had people on my caseload. For example, I had a lifer who had glaucoma, and he had requested tests to see if he was a viable candidate for some sort of treatment or surgery, and he languished in our unit for an entire year before they sent him to Lake Butler CI that has a certified hospital. He got there, and he was undergoing a bunch of tests, and then the ophthalmologist came over to him and said, "You've got glaucoma." He was so angry you could not imagine. Of course he knew he had glaucoma, and this is the typical Corizon response. Delay, and sometimes they even withhold treatment, as in the case of the inmate who was gassed to death. His last name was Aparo Jordan, and he had complained to Corizon nurses that he was in need of hospitalization and immediate medical attention, and when they denied him treatment, he became irate to the point where the nurses called the guards, and then they ended up shuffling him off to a solitary cell and gassing him to death.
We find this to be cultural. It's a cultural way of thinking of prisoners as less than human, like not deserving of anything. We just reported last week people dying where a young boy, 19 years old, in prison died of gangrene in his leg, and they left him for 5 days, several days at one point, where they hadn't even given him food or water and didn't care if he had any. So he died in prison of gangrene, something that could have
read about that.
Solved, and that was just one. And then the other one was another woman that died of constipation. Like, who dies of constipation? If you're in prison, you can die of constipation. So, this is like a culture where not only does the medical facilities, which are supposed to provide health care and life-saving services, but also the guards will literally just leave you in a cell to die and watch you die and giggle about it while you're dying.
Absolutely. And I can tell you that I treated the inmates with respect, and they treated me in kind. And what guards don't understand is they can get a lot further through words than with violence. And I'd just like to say one thing about correctional officers. There are a lot of really good correctional officers out there, and I had the pleasure of working one within my unit. And he always kept my section of the unit quiet. He did his best to meet the inmates' needs, and we never had any outbursts where people would go crazy, whereas I know for a fact that this one sergeant would come in during, first shift change at 8 o'clock in the morning and rile up to inmates who would, scream and yell, bang their head against the window, and this was his daily fun. This is what these guards did. It was all a big joke to them.
When you mentioned, go ahead. Sorry about that, Yohanan.
I was going to say there's one when you said that, just a name came to mind. Roland Austin was the one that I remember reading about. That this guy was known for bashing people's heads into the walls and choking people out, grabbing them by the throat, and choke slamming inmates or whatever. And this guy was there for 23 years. He had no issues. His work record was sterling. He was always, getting commendations and everything else. And he walked around bragging about he had gotten away with murder several times. So, this is the thing. And, Mike Cruz coming in and letting go of, 42 or 49, employees or something like that crazy. I mean, do you think from what you know about from the inside, is that going to affect anything?
Not that few people. Michael Cruz is going on and on about 99.9% of the 23,000. Well, 1/10 of 1% of 23,000 is 23 people. Exactly. That doesn't begin to cover it. I mean, there were 23 people in my unit that were probably corrupt morally and otherwise.
Getting out of there.
Yeah. So, with that being said, I have a question for you that I'd like to ask too, if I can. We, as you know, we're here as abolitionists. We'd like to see an end to all private prisons across America, to have them banned from this nation forever. We are also very familiar with the idea that 70% of inmates are in there for nonviolent drug-related crimes, and we'd like to see the majority, if not all of those inmates freed.
All of them.
You know what I mean? I say majority because, who knows what's going on. But nonetheless, that's something like 1.6 million people freed. So, and we also would like to see the abolition of the federal constitution's exception clause in the 13th Amendment, as well as state constitutions' exception clauses in theirs as well. And for those reasons, we consider ourselves abolitionists, and we move towards abolitionism. Do you consider yourself, after your experiences now, an abolitionist?
Yes, I've got to say, in theory and in spirit, I'm totally there. I've done a little research since I spoke to Yohanan last week. I mean, I was shocked. I think I missed that day in civics class in high school. But that cannot continue to exist. I can't imagine other civilized countries making exceptions like we're making here. It doesn't make sense.
Our experience and our research has shown us that this goes back as far as 1841 in Ohio, where they put their exception clause into it and immediately started using the prison system as a alternative to slavery at the time. And we found that basically Lincoln just mirrored what worked for Ohio for the entire nation.
Yeah, that's just really scary, because that also minimizes these men, these human beings, and they're treated poorly enough and not respected by, most of the guards, and to have that on top of them as well. These inmates are so incredibly powerless, and they're rendered into, almost cowering, hoping that they won't be beaten or killed.
And most, if not, a majority of them are innocent people. Like the young lady we mentioned who died of constipation. She was in there for harassment. I mean, harassment, and you die in prison.
Right.
And the other cases, like the war veteran who tried to get warm in Chicago in the winter by sleeping in the hallway, was taken to a prison and baked to death.
Right. Jerome Murtaugh.
Yeah, Jerome Murtaugh. Well,
these are sick cases.
There's more than enough reasons for us to end this in this country, and I don't understand why more people aren't waking up, but they are waking up. We can attest to that personally. I just wish it would happen quicker. We also are part of an organization called the IDB Wells Foundation Against Mass Incarceration and Prison Slavery, and we're trying to build some committees. I'd like to invite you maybe to join that group and see how you might be able to get involved and help in bringing this all together to the point where we can end this for us all.
Right, George, you had mentioned when we spoke before the interview, and you'd spoken to me about your idea about the IPA. Is that something that you have developed enough to maybe you want to share some of that with us here? Or?
Well, I have. The idea occurred to me last week. The prison industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's unregulated. there's no governing body, there's no regulatory body. So in the spirit of the Environmental Protection Agency, I propose the Inmate Protection Agency. And they would be under a broad mandate to provide guidelines not only for our state prisons, but private prisons, and also private health providers and mental health providers like Horizon Health Incorporated. By the way, Horizon had no guidelines or trainings on how to recognize inmate abuse and to report it. So as an employee, I had no idea what to do when I was confronted with abuse. I saw that abuse for years and just brushed it off as, oh, prison, this is a terrible place to be. You know, and I never once saw it as abuse until the beating, when that shook me out of my complacency. And then I realized, oh, my God, I've seen years of abuse.
You had just become conditioned to it over time. And I guess in certain parts, as a psychologist, I guess I'm not trying to do your job, but you just have to start justifying things in your mind, like this is a part of the process, like you just said, you know, prison, or what a terrible thing to do.
How do you explain that?
Well, I was not, Horizon did not provide any information to its employees as to what abuse was. I mean, certainly, yes, if an inmate gets beaten, oh, okay, that's abuse. I know what that is. But how about a harsh cell search where they come in, they throw everything around the room, they rip up family photos, they put a guy's radio in the toilet? You know, I just brushed it off and thought, oh, this is prison. What a crappy place to be. Mm-hmm. Now I realize that's inmate abuse. You can't do that. And the guards who would go by and taunt inmates, same thing. I thought, oh, prison, horrible place to be. That's inmate abuse. They didn't teach us what it was, you know, and in my mind, Horizon and these other companies that don't provide guidelines are complicit in the abuse of inmates, because the DOCs will not regulate themselves, so it falls on the private sector. I mean, it fell on me to do the incident reports regarding the beating of the inmate. You know, it shouldn't have gotten that far. The unit shouldn't have slid that far.
I have a quick question for you, and again, I want to thank you for spending your time this evening with us here on New Abolitionist Radio. I'm certainly sure that our listeners appreciate, you know, you bringing your perspective from a person who's on the inside and as a healthcare professional. But just real quick, just to revisit, we're talking about the state of Florida. We cover state constitutions and what they say about slavery and whether or not they have an exception clause that mirrors the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And so I'm looking at Florida's Constitution, and slavery is nowhere mentioned in it. The closest thing that comes to it is that you are not supposed to imprison people for debt, but there's no mention of slavery. It doesn't say slavery has been abolished and involuntary servitude has been abolished, except for punishment for crime. It makes no reference to slavery whatsoever. So I thought
the end of it never occurred in Florida, just like it didn't happen in South Carolina.
There was nothing passed. Well, it shouldn't exist at all. It shouldn't have to be an amendment. You know what I'm saying? Prohibiting it. You know, the 13th Amendment clearly needs to say that it has been abolished. But come on, we're in the 21st century now. This should be a no-brainer. You know what I'm saying? So that's
I agree.
Yeah, this is interesting, you know, about the state of Florida, what its constitution does not say about, you know, the mistreatment of human beings, convicted of crimes and all their rights stripped of them. But also, please.
I was going to say, I don't think Florida is particularly enlightened. I just think that, you know, it's dumb luck that it didn't get put in there. I mean, we're not seeing any enlightened response from our governor. You know, quite frankly, this Department of Corrections is riddled with amoral, sadistic sociopaths and the people that enable and support them.
Can you say it again? Amoral, sadistic sociopaths. You know, my question has been now for months, what about all the sociopaths? It's like nobody wants to recognize the fact that a lot of our positions of power are being run by sociopaths. All you have to do, you can recognize the symptoms if you look, you know? And we have people running prisons and hospitals and nurseries and day schools and police officers and judges who are sociopaths. So, you know, we see somebody who's bipolar or schizophrenic, and we immediately take precautions, we give them medication, we make sure that they get seen, and we don't put them in charge of the kids, you know? But that's what we see right now with our political structure as well as our business and justice system.
Yeah, one last question as we get ready to wrap up our interview with you, and please make sure you give out the information on your book. No, you straight, Max. I'm sorry, we just kind of pressed for time, and I did have one in question that I feel is important with our guest being a healthcare professional, but in that field, in that profession, do they not recognize that the United Nations has said that solitary confinement is torture? And what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I have quite a lot of thinking on that regard. And the problem with the mentally ill is because funding has dried up for treatment centers in our communities and mental institutions, jails and prisons are now becoming the repositories for the mentally ill, and they're very poorly equipped to deal with the mentally ill. And typically, somebody who's mentally ill, who's remanded into custody after they've been found guilty, which is a stretch because some of these guys are schizophrenic and should not be in prison in the first place, they lump them together into a reception center with the general population. So they decompensate, they go crazy, in other words. They might get into a fight, and then by DOC rules, they're put into solitary, which is completely counterindicated for their symptoms. The mentally ill should never be in solitary. It's a hard enough stretch for somebody who's normal. And so this is barbaric on a level that is, harkens back to the Middle Ages.
Well, George, as Scotty said before, we're going to wrap up this conversation and definitely, invite you. The door's open, please. Any developments or new connections, new findings, anything that goes on, from your spot in the trenches, the door is open. Please come back and speak with us and maybe even more in depth on some of what you saw. I mean, you never know what will be the thing that will spark the next, the rise of the next abolitionist, the awakening of the next abolitionist or activist that moves with some power. So do you want to please give us your contact information, where we can get the book, how we can contact you, blog, websites, what have you?
My website is georgemallinckrodt.com. The book can be found on every bookseller now has it. But you can go to Amazon and get the Kindle and paperback version. And it's my hope that by speaking out and reaching out to people and organizations like yours and the new Abolitionist Radio, that I'm getting the word out and people are getting educated as to what's happening in our prisons. And we've got to ask ourselves as Americans, does our identity as Americans include the torture, beating, and murder of inmates that are in our prison system? As an American, for me, no way.
No way. Yes, we feel the same way. Abolition is the answer, we believe, not reform. Reform is just offering some kind of, tidbits or pittances while they continue to exploit people and murder people and abuse people and not really change the system or get rid of it. There's no reason for any prison for profit. There's no reason for any kind of punishment for sale. It just should not be allowed in any civilization at all. Even right now to this day, only America and the Philippines are the only two countries that even allow bails bondsmen. It's crazy. Well, thank you very much for being part of my show.
Max, I'm sorry, I don't mean to step on you, but we got a caller. Perhaps is it okay if we take a call if a caller has a question for you? Is that okay before you leave? Okay.
Okay. Well, we do have a caller for you. Caller, welcome to New Abolitionist Radio.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I thought the show was over.
No, who are we speaking to and where are you calling from?
My name is Isatu, and I'm calling from Tempe, Arizona.
Oh, peace and welcome.
Thank you. Well, actually, now I just have a comment because you just sort of touched on the sociopathic mentality of our leaders and things like that. So, so-called leaders, for lack of a better word. But what I have wanted to touch on for all you gentlemen is the widespread fact that even though our men and women and children are ending up in these institutions, the main ones that are putting them there is A, the police, because that's the first person that usually is involved, or CPS, the Child Protective Services, and then B, the prosecution, the prosecutors, and then the judges. So, those two, especially the judges, are just madly out of control, unaccountable, and although I appreciate the focus on the prison system right now because I understand what the premise is. Really and truly, the focus really absolutely needs to be on the judges and the prosecution.
Agreed.
And I just wanted to see, what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I'm familiar with the Kids for Cash campaign. Are you familiar with that, George?
No, I'm not.
Isn't that in Philadelphia or something like that?
In Pennsylvania,
I do.
Where 2 judges were prosecuted and convicted and are now serving 28 years for selling nearly 5,000 children to a private prison in Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
The private prison went by the inconspicuous name of Philadelphia Child Care or Pennsylvania Child Care. So it made it sound like it was some kind of daycare center, but it was literally a prison, and they were sending these kids there with no trials, no charges for things like writing on a desk.
No, they were given trials, Max, but the judges were getting kickbacks from the company.
That's
putting
evil.
kids in prison for talking back, for throwing spitballs, for basic teenage high school foolishness or whatever. Yeah.
So there's a movie out called Kids for Cash that tells all about it. But what it doesn't touch on is the fact that the private prison that was financing all of this, upwards of $400 million, only got fined $2.5 million and are still in business today.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And then the last thing I had to say, and I'll let you gentlemen go.
Well, before you do, I'm sorry. Before you do, let me answer also your question. For me, myself, and I probably can speak for my comrades as well, is we don't view any part of the system as being separate. We don't view the judiciary as being apart from the prosecutors or the police departments or, the federal courts, the state courts. All of them work in concert. All of them have all of these degrees, and, I will hope and pretty sure they know what the 13th Amendment says, and they know what they are practicing. Okay. And so it's all part of the system of slavery. It just has been refined and updated. And this is what we have in the 21st century slavery. All of it, it is like Max has used the analogy of, the slave blocks are the courthouses now or something like that, Max?
Courthouses are processing plants where people get processed into the prisons.
Yeah.
Like meat.
Just like they processed you off of that ship or, an enslaved African off a ship,
Right.
It's all, we know the police department started as hired hands of the wealthy plantation owners, and, they were called slave patrols, and then they turned into police departments. It's all connected, is all I would like to say. And please go ahead with the last thing you wanted to share with us.
Absolutely, that you're right on with that. Right on, brother. The last thing is I heard recently about the corporations that are actually have call centers and people are making microchip boards and things like that inside these institutions.
Oh yeah.
So I just haven't heard a lot about it. I mean, someone was telling me about it. And then I just thought it was interesting because, when you come out, you're a felon. You can't get a job at AT&T or Intel or, but when you're inside these places, you're fully employed at 20 cents
There's nearly 1 million prisoners who were documented as being employed under the prisons. And just in 2013, 37 states passed legislation that allowed private companies to use prison labor in their daily business practices. And companies like Walmart and Burger King and McDonald's and even Starbucks have been involved in that. They have an incentive where the government gives back 40% of the salary paid by the companies to the prisons. And the prisons are making commercials asking companies to use their services, saying things like, our people are here every week. They don't have babysitting problems. They don't have traveling problems. They don't take days off, and they're happy to work for $1 an hour or 11 cents an hour.
$1 a day, yeah.
$1 a day or 11 cents an hour.
George, that's something that I would ask you. I know we keep saying we're going to let you go. That's something that, since that's come up, did you have any access? Did you see any prison labor practices going on, or did you get wind of any aspect of that?
No, actually, because I was in a mental health unit, a psych unit, all of the men in the unit were isolated from the compound or the prison, and I was as well. So I wasn't privy to any sort of working arrangements along those lines. In fact, one of the running jokes was, we'll always have a job because we're in a growth industry. And I got to tell you, that's pretty scary when the business model of these private corporations is dependent on longer sentences and incarcerating more people.
Right.
And since our callers from Arizona, just point out that Arizona has 3 prisons with a guaranteed 100% occupancy rate for 25 years.
Right.
Oh, brother, I live in Maricopa County. It's big business in Maricopa County with Sheriff Joe, which is, he has tours of people come from overseas to tour his facility, which is called Tent City. And he's very proud to torture the prisoners there. So it's big business in Maricopa County.
You all just confirmed Republican Mark, how do you call his name, Bronovich, for Attorney General out there, and he's a former lobbyist for the private prisons. So, the beat goes on.
Well, George, would you like to have any final comments before we get on to the next story? Anything you want to leave us with?
And thank you, caller. Thank you for
thank you, ISIS. Right? Thank you so much, ISIS. ISIS. Please call in again. Appreciate you.
Yeah, I just want to say that I'm going to continue in my efforts to bring to light the plight of the mentally ill and to highlight how they go through the system. We had so many people on our caseload where we were continually asking ourselves, how did they find this guy fit for trial? And that's got to change. We've got to do better as a society when it comes to the mentally ill, because these people can't hold down jobs. They can't live in an apartment, so they get into crimes just to survive. And right now we're failing them miserably.
Indeed.
Wow. Thanks again, George. And you're welcome anytime. I will send information via Yohanan to you regarding the Ida B. Wells Foundation and maybe how you can participate. Excellent.
Glad to be on the show tonight.
Thanks for coming, George. Have a good evening.
Good night.
You too. Okay.
Awesome testimony there from George.
I would agree.
And I really hope that a lot of people get his book so they can understand how people are being murdered in these prisons. Innocent people joining in for the most ridiculous things.
Oh, yeah.
Being maimed and destroyed and murdered and killed to the point where you get boiled alive.
And what did he say? 90% of his skin came off. Wow.
90% of skin came off.
And amazing to me is that the country, I know we got to go to break and kind of reset, but amazing to me is that the country is perfectly fine with these people meeting these circumstances, and this is not just Florida. It's not just Dade County. We talk about this on this program every single week, state after state after state, all over the country, hundreds and hundreds of deaths, suspicious situations, people getting beat, getting maimed, whatever is going on all over the country. Right. And the rapes, of course, that too. in the country, the culture, our society, our neighbors, our church members, our co-workers at our jobs, the parents at our daycare, the school teachers, whoever, are comfortable with these circumstances being met by these people for basically petty crimes. I mean, sure, you have a percentage of people that are there for violent crimes against other individuals and major, violent acts or whatever they've done, but the majority is nonviolent, and most of it is for drug possession or distribution, some sort of thing like that. And the society is fine with people meeting violence at the hands of sociopaths that, instead of doing violence on the outside on the streets, or they may do it and they just don't get caught, they do violence to people that are captive in cages and forced to do slave labor. They do violence to them, and they don't ever get prosecuted. They don't ever get written up for anything. They don't ever lose their jobs. And if they do lose their job, their record is still clean, and they go get the same job somewhere else, and they make a living off the tax dollars. They make a living. They retire. They seem like perfectly good citizens or whatever. And you don't even know this person may have killed 10 people in the course of his career.
Might be a serial killer. I'm sure there's some serial killers among them.
Yeah. If I was one, I would go get a job. I would go do that. You could, not even being a cop. Being a cop, you might get caught eventually if you just keep killing people. But apparently you could be a corrections officer and just keep knocking people off.
You're listening to New Abolitionist Radio with Max Parthas, Scotty Reid, and Yohanan EliYah. We'll be right back after this.